Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, January 4th, 2021, and tomorrow is the day that we've all been waiting for in the state of Georgia. Tomorrow, probably around 1 million Georgia residents will cast their ballots as to who they wish to be the next two United States senators from this battleground state. It went to Joe Biden by just under a percentage point, just under half a percentage point at that, and it's a state where the Republican Party has been direly needing to win because of the fact that if the Democrats win here, they win the Senate majority. The Republican Party cannot afford to lose both of these Senate seats because they do not have control of the House and they do not have control of the presidency, which means this is the last stand for the Republican Party in order to prevent any type of major legislation passed through the Biden administration. However, if the Democratic Party is able to win here, Vice President Kamala Harris would break the tie, and then she would in turn give the majority to the Democratic Party. So as you can see, there is a lot at stake in the state of Georgia specifically. And looking at the candidates across these races, both parties have fielded moderately strong and moderately weak candidates all around. But when you're looking at the preliminary election data, the early voting numbers, the polling data, the political betting markets, everything that's been happening, there's been some very weird conclusions that have been very different than what we would have concluded maybe a month or 2 months ago, looking at these two Senate races. So we can actually take a look. Flashback to November 2020. I know it seems like it was a far time ago, but the election is still being contested by some Republicans in the Senate. And also, David Perdue is no longer a senator. So this election will truly determine whether or not those were his final few days in the Senate. So David Perdue cannot vote against. Kelly Loeffler can, but David Perdue cannot vote against the certification of the election results. He will not be able to because he is no longer an active senator. He's going to keep this spot open, at least vacant, for 2-3 days, depending on when the votes get counted and who we know is going to absolutely win the election. But in Georgia, what we're looking at is that this state voted against Donald Trump in the 2020 election. You know, the election isn't something that Georgia voters want to see contested to the fullest extent. It would be very different if it was in neighboring South Carolina or neighboring Alabama or neighboring Tennessee, because those states went to Donald Trump by a very large margin. South Carolina maybe not as large as Alabama or Tennessee, but when you're looking at the margins of victory, you can guarantee it that a majority of the voters there do believe that the election should be contested. Georgia is not one of those states. Georgia is not a state where Donald Trump could go and argue to the voters that voted for Joe Biden for president that the election should somehow be contested and that Donald Trump somehow won the election. If the voters already disapproved of you as a presidential candidate, you can't imagine your impact would be too heavy in a runoff election, unless turnout was very different than it was on the presidential level. And I think that's what the Republican Party is counting on. Looking at the amount of voters in the regular election, we saw record-breaking turnout. The runoff elections look as if they may actually match 2016 election turnout. And if that's the case, the Republican Party might be happier because high turnout traditionally benefits the Democratic Party. That wasn't necessarily the case nationwide, but in Georgia, that was the case. In Georgia, when we saw majority-minority districts turn out in very large margins, Joe Biden won the state of Georgia for the first time in 28 years. Donald Trump is the first Republican to lose this state. McCain won it. Romney won it. Trump won it 4 years ago. 6% of voters moved over in favor of Joe Biden. And that's largely due to the fact that Donald Trump lost a considerable amount of support amongst the Atlanta metro area. When you're looking at the suburbs, and this region takes up 67% of the state's population, when you're looking at the suburbs around this area, a lot of them moved away from Donald Trump. The reason why his loss wasn't as great because of this suburban shift is because Donald Trump did better with minority voters than he did in 2016. Considerably better. It was enough so that it offset some of the gains made by the Biden campaign in states such as Nevada or states such as Ohio, where Joe Biden was able to shift some suburbs around major cities. Donald Trump was able to shift minority areas that weren't necessarily too favorable to Republicans, even Donald Trump in 2016. But looking at the Georgia results, we are looking at the president of the United States who lost the regular election 49.5 to 49.26. Close, right? Well, the early voting numbers actually had him losing by around 6%. So the same day election turnout that broke for President Trump, 60 to 38, was what put him actually closer to Joe Biden, much closer than 6 points. But the Republican Party is going to need more than that because Donald Trump still couldn't win the election, winning the election day vote 60 to 38. That's a 22-point margin on election day, which means the Republican Party is going to need to count on a very high level of turnout in Republican districts tomorrow, and they're going to need to count on the margin being much larger than it was for Donald Trump, because not only will they need to outperform Donald Trump, that's assuming the early votes benefit the Democratic Party the same way. It's actually going to benefit them a lot more. There's a website called GeorgiaVotes.com that tracks the runoff election, and we see now that 3,041,581 voters have voted in the state of Georgia. That means through absentee ballots, mail-in, or voting in person early, but whatever it might be, we actually have the breakdown by race. We have the breakdown by race and ethnicity. Now, why is this information important? Well, we don't know the actual election results of the early votes just yet, but we can get a general idea based off of the race and ethnicity breakdown. Why? Well, there's a very clear correlation between race and voting patterns. If you're looking at the minority group as a whole, Black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian voters across the country, Native American voters, whichever group that isn't white, traditionally votes for the Democratic Party. Black voters are the most solid Democratic voting group in the entire country, splitting 90-10 on multiple occasions. In Georgia, specifically, the white voting bloc, however, is very solid for the Republican Party. Now, college-educated white voters do tend to favor the Democratic Party a little bit more, but that's not the majority of the electorate. White voters make up roughly 75% of the American electorate. I think this election it was actually knocked down to 67% because we saw record-breaking turnout amongst minority groups, but traditionally that's how it goes, especially in a state such as Georgia. But when you're looking at the breakdown, well, at least in runoff elections, not in presidential elections, when turnout is high, like I had mentioned, the Democratic Party typically does better, which is why the Republican Party was trying to count on a situation where people were complacent with a Biden victory, and in turn, older, whiter voters voted, because there's also a very clear correlation between race and voter patterns in terms of how often people vote. So voter frequency. You know, it's a fact that older, whiter voters vote at a much higher rate than any other demographic group in the country. White, richer, older voters at that. You know, the top 1% has a 98% voting turnout in almost every election. In 2016, 98% of the people in the top 1% voted. 40% of the people in the bottom 10% voted. So you can see there's also correlation, so many things, so many underlying levels about correlation between race, income, whatever it might be, age, in terms of how, you know, people vote frequently. But we can go ahead and move past that. Let's just look at the breakdown by race and ethnicity, and you can see that white voters still take out the majority in the state of Georgia. The early vote is expected to favor the Democratic Party, so you can assume once everything is said and done, the white voting bloc will be higher than 55.7%. But the early voting numbers tell us that 55.7% of all the early voters were white, 30.9% were black, 2.2% were Hispanic, 2.5% were Asian, and 8.7% were other, mixed, whatever is thrown into that category according to the Georgia Secretary of State. Well, how does this compare? Well, there's a reason why I said the Republican Party is going to need to do better than they did in the 2020 November election based off the early voting numbers. That is true, because the early voting numbers in Georgia, keep in mind the Democratic Party still won this state based off these early voting numbers. White voters made up a higher percent of the total early vote. Non-Hispanic black voters made up 27.7%. This is a difference of 3 points. It may not seem like a lot, but I don't have to remind you how close the Georgia regular election actually was. So every single percentage point counts, and the fact that the percent black vote is up to 30.9%, there's no way you can draw a conclusion other than the fact that the Democratic Party might actually perform better, will actually perform better than they did in the early vote in the runoff election versus the early vote in the November election. The only demographic groups that are down are Hispanic and Asian voters, both down from 2.6%, but nothing super significant. The reason why they have gone down actually is because the percent of black voters has gone up, and every other group is going to have to compensate for that. So every other group takes a hit because black voters are turning out at a higher rate than they did in the regular election, and that's something the Democratic Party might actually be very happy about, might actually be very confident going into these runoff elections. Now, no particular party should be confident about the outcome of this election. This election is going to be contested through the end, through the bitter, bitter end. We could actually see this election drawn out for 3-4 days, considering how long it took to count the ballots in the presidential election. People thought this would be different because there wouldn't be 5 million ballots, but it looks like we might actually hit 4. And if there's 4, it's going to take just as long to count all of these ballots, especially with Georgia's, being closely watched by many members of both political parties, that we could see pressure from the president as he did, I'll get to that in a moment, as he did on Brad Raffensperger or whoever it might be. When we're talking about the Georgia election results, we could see some pressure from external political figures. But also, that's something that's all speculation. We don't know how, or we don't know who is going to win these races yet. It really all depends. President Trump probably won't press anything in if the Republican Party ends up victorious. But looking at the preliminary election data, this is sign number 1 or 2 that the numbers actually aren't going to benefit the Republican Party as heavily as they did. And even then, Donald Trump still lost the early vote by 6 points, enough that he lost the entire state. So the next thing I want to take a look at is the Georgia Senate runoff election polls. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably rolling your eyes. Why are we talking about polling data? Well, Georgia was fairly accurate in the 2020 election. In fact, it was off well within the margin of error of just 1 point. It was off by exactly 1%, actually a little bit under 1 percentage point. So the polls weren't too wrong. They predicted the election victory, and they predicted that both candidates would be under 50%. Now, the difference here is that there won't be that many undecided voters because the runoff election forces you to choose between 2 candidates, and Perdue and Loeffler are not exactly as polarizing names as Biden or Trump, just because this is statewide politics. You're not going to be judged by someone from Massachusetts. Well, so you think. People are very heavily invested into this race, but you wouldn't necessarily be, you wouldn't associate Perdue and Loeffler too heavily as the Trump name. You wouldn't be afraid to say you're voting for the Republican candidate in a state if you're a Republican. But when you're looking at the Ossoff and Warnock numbers, they both lead, but let's swing it by the same margin that they swung on the presidential level. The polls did. How wrong were they? Well, they were off by just under a percentage point. So even if you did swing both of these races, the Republican Party would remain, the Democratic Party would remain victorious. So not only is the early vote telling us, the Democratic Party is going to do well, the polling numbers are telling us the exact same story. I started out analyzing this race with the assumption that the Republican Party had this in the bag. I thought this was going to be a race where the Republican Party could capitalize on the idea that there would need to be a check on a president-elect Biden. But because this state has 2 Republican senators who have not acknowledged the election results, that can't be used in their political ads. They cannot argue that there will be a check on a President Biden if they are going to argue to their constituents and to America that the election is not over, that Donald Trump fairly won the election. So that's not an argument that can be made. That's an argument that works with more moderate, more independent voters. But if you are a senator, 2 at that are telling the American people that maybe the election was rigged, or maybe the election in Georgia wasn't fair, I can't imagine that would go too well, considering that you would need to win over some of these supporters, which are maybe traditionally left-wing, but also do want to see a balance of powers. You couldn't argue that. That's not something you could say publicly. That's not something you could send out in an attack ad, or something you can send out in a pro-Perdue or pro-Loeffler ad. It's something they could have had Donald Trump conceded the presidential election when he lost 4 days after the election, but obviously since that didn't occur, they have stuck with him, and they are paying the price for it. So we've covered the early voting numbers. We've covered the polling numbers. Well, let's take a look at the political betting markets. What did these actually tell us? Well, these weren't super accurate in the 2020 election. They were off by 2 states, but they still got a number of them correct. They got Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and every other state correct except for Arizona and Georgia. So those are the only ones that they were really considerably off on. But they currently project that Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock will win in their Senate seats. Georgia was actually a state that expected to go to Donald Trump. They actually gave him a pretty high % share on election day. Well, they were wrong. They overestimated Republican support in this state, and they could be doing that now. But also, when you're wrong once, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be wrong in just one way or another. People could very well be wrong about these 2 Senate races. But the fact they have changed is also significant. I made a video about Georgia's betting odds flipping in the special election because I thought that was super significant. There has never been a time since after the election where Jon Ossoff has taken the lead over David Perdue. Well, now it's happened. And now both candidates, Democratic candidates at that, are leading in both of their Senate races according to PredictIt. Well, what even does, PredictIt tell us? Well, essentially a lot of these voters and a lot of these political bettors are spending a lot of money on these races, sometimes hundreds, thousands of dollars invested in singular races. And a lot of the times they're not going to go with their, biased beliefs. They may want a Democrat to win in Wyoming, but they know a Republican will win. That's exactly what's happening here. People try to put aside their political beliefs and try to take an analytical point of view because at the end of the day, one thing that's common amongst all these people in the betting pool is that they do not want to lose money. So when they bet, they're almost sure and very confident of their bet because a lot of the times they are going to end up losing money if they end up betting incorrectly. So looking at Georgia specifically, looking at these 2 races in a betting market that overestimated Republican support, this may be a telling sign for the Democratic Party. But then again, that's just reading the tea leaves. There's nothing super significant telling us that. It's just, actually there is, but there isn't anything telling us, concrete that, the election is over. we should absolutely say the Democratic Party has the outright advantage. Tomorrow will be my video when I actually discuss my true final predictions for both of these Senate races, but right now the Democratic Party has been taking every opportunity to inch up closer and closer and closer and closer to the Republican Party, where now, even predicted, puts them in the advantage. So we can actually go ahead and take a look at one of our final points that I'm going to be making here, and that this leaked audio tape is not going to help turnout for the Republican Party. This leaked audio tape, I don't know if you've heard it, you can find it anywhere, it's an hour long, but essentially Donald Trump asked Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Georgia Secretary of State, just 2 days ago to add votes to his vote total, telling him that it was a crime for him allowing Joe Biden to win the election, essentially threatening him without directly saying it. On top of that, he argued that no one would blame him if he quote-unquote recalculated and found him was the exact word, I hope you find votes. Find 11,780. Why that number? Well, we can go back to the margin of victory for Joe Biden in this state, 11,779. So he wanted just one more vote than Joe Biden, and he was telling Brad Raffensperger no one would fault him for quote-unquote recalculating the election results. And Donald Trump tried to argue that it's because he was cheated out of the election, that he actually won Georgia by hundreds of thousands of votes, and all he's asking for is just a mere 11,000. But there's no evidence to back up these baseless claims of election fraud. And now he's asking the Georgia Republican Secretary of State to take the election. Of course, Brad Raffensperger said no. He pushed back, and he had an hour-long pretty much argument with President Trump. That wasn't super heated, but it was definitely an argument going back and forth between differing ideologies within the Republican Party, and this could not have come at a more worse time, a more inconvenient time for these two Georgia Republicans, because Donald Trump is set to speak there today. I don't know if he's changed that or not, but he was set to speak in Georgia on Monday. Today's Monday. And he's trying to get out the vote. But if these voters view him as someone who's cheating in the election, a cheat, a fraud, whatever the term is, the Democratic Party has money to send out ads today, doing this right before the election. This is something that the Republican Party may want to distance themselves because of Loeffler and Perdue, which are already being treated as crooks and villains by the Democratic Party in that state for insider trading, supposed insider trading. You can only imagine how easily that would play into that rhetoric, how easily that would play into the Democratic Party's hand, how easily they could use this to bring down Kelley Loeffler and bring down David Perdue. Because no matter what, when you're looking at all of the preliminary election data, whether it's the early voting numbers, they benefit the Democratic Party. Whether it's the polling numbers, they benefit the Democratic Party. Whether it's the polling numbers from 2020, they tell us the same story they told us back then, and they were right and predict it. We're looking at a somewhat unbiased political betting market. They're telling us the Democratic Party now has the advantage. This is the first time this has happened in 2 months, ever since the election. This is the first time. And of course, something has to come up, right? And it's a Donald Trump scandal that directly involves Georgia Republicans. So this is pushing the Republican Party into the corner of the boxing match. This is the corner of the boxing arena. The Democratic Party is throwing every last punch, every $1 out of the 100 million raised for both candidates, right? And if you're looking at this race, there is so much at stake for both political parties that honestly, I thought the Republican Party would be able to do better damage control. Making sure that they actually had this race in the bag, because they do need it. The Republican Party needs it in order to check President Biden. But also, the Democratic Party needs it if they want to have any chance at passing anything consequential, passing anything that they really want to. Because they have the House, they of course have the White House, the Senate is the only thing left. And everything for both political parties hinges on 2 Senate races in Georgia. And right now, it doesn't look too good for the Republican Party. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my post-2020 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.